I was told I was going to Australia, and that was on a troop ship which got to Sydney round about October 1945. We decided to go and see the sights of Sydney. And we were walking along this road, and this chap came running up to us and said, "Hey, you chaps, stop, I want to ask you a question. Where will you go when you die? It must be either heaven or hell."
Well, I was looking in a camera shop window in the Piccadilly Arcade near George Street. A man tapped me on the shoulder and he said, "If you were to die within the next 24 hours, where would your soul be?" When I was walking down George Street, a man came up to me and asked me this wonderful question, this question which sort of frightened me. He said, "If you were to die within 24 hours, where would you spend eternity?"
Who was this man asking a question on eternity? Frank Jenner was his name, and the question became known as the Frank Jenner question. He would say, "May I ask you a question? If you died within 24 hours, where would you be in eternity? Heaven or hell?" He had a profound impact on individuals from all over the world by asking this question on eternity. The story about this soul-winning sailor from Sydney would have remained relatively unknown if it were not for Francis Dixon, a Baptist preacher from England. To get a better understanding of Frank and his unique ministry, we need to go back to his past and the history of the street he walked on, George Street, Sydney.
At the mouth of Sydney Cove, where George Street starts, the first Christian service was conducted by Richard Johnson, the chaplain to the First Fleet. After 20,000 kilometres of sea to the huge congregation of 1,000 convicts, Marines and officers under Governor Phillip, he took as his text, "What shall I render unto the Lord for all his benefits? I'll take the cup of salvation and call upon the name of the Lord." Psalm 116. And he was a strong evangelical. He had been handpicked by the leading evangelicals of the day in England, Newton and Cowper and William Wilberforce, and recommended to the Prime Minister as such as would be suitable to propagate the gospel in New South Wales.
On the occasion of the departure of Reverend Richard Johnson with the First Fleet to Botany Bay, Australia, John Newton, author of the famous hymn Amazing Grace, wrote the first poem to be inspired by Australia. Here is an excerpt from it. "Going to Botany Bay, go bear the Saviour's name to lands unknown. Tell to the southern world his wondrous grace, an energy divine thy words shall own, and draw their untaught hearts to seek his face."
Richard Johnson built the first church with his own hands and resources. It was burnt down by the convicts. They hated religion. Samuel Marsden was the other Englishman who came to join him. Samuel Marsden went to Parramatta, where he stayed for the rest of his life and where he built the very first permanent church in Australia, St John's, built in 1810. And he became a very wealthy landowner as well as a magistrate, as well as evangelising the South Sea Islands and taking the gospel to New Zealand. George Street was Sydney's and Australia's first street. It followed the bullock track from the landing of the First Fleet through the centre of what was to become the business district of Sydney. It was first of all a military road because the Marines of the First Fleet established their barracks there, and it was the line of ceremonial march for them. It was named George Street after King George III of England. Soon were built along George Street a string of evangelical churches. at the same time, the culture of the local population was one of heavy and hard drinking and gambling. In 1901, the per capita income of Australians was the highest in the world. And Sydney has a magnificent harbour, and New South Wales was and Sydney was the centre of Australia's trading output to the world. George Street in the 1930s and 40s evolved greatly from its early origins as a bullock track. There are trams now running down the centre of the street. George Street has always been a barometer of Sydney life, a place that has been bathed in prayer. In the 1930s, an Irish evangelist called Cairo Bradley, he instituted a prayer meeting at which 1,000 people were gathered every Wednesday in the basement of the town hall. So there were prayer meetings. There were open air meetings up and down George Street from early days. Arthur Stace, after his conversion, he had a open air meeting further up George Street. Arthur Stace was a converted alcoholic. The man who preached to him, Archdeacon R.B.S. Hammond, a friend of the drunkard, probably Sydney's greatest evangelist. Arthur Stace, after his conversion, he heard Reverend John Ridley, a fiery Baptist soul winner, preach a sermon on eternity, and that word stuck in his mind. He was illiterate, yet he started to write this word. How he did it, he did not know himself. Eternity on the footwalks of Sydney for 25 years. It made a powerful impression on many people. And when the 2000th anniversary came, that word was emblazoned on the Sydney Harbour Bridge as a symbol of the new millennium in Sydney. We have all these strong identities who preached the gospel, and among them all was Frank Jenner. And Frank Jenner knew them all, worked with them all. He had only one gift, that was as a personal worker. He was a person who would look you straight in the eye, and sincerity was written all over his face, earnestness.
My father was Frank Jenner. He was excited at being a Christian and he wanted others to know about it too. He said, I've made a promise to God that I'm going to speak for 10 people per day for the rest of my life and tell them all about Jesus. So he decided then that he was going to say to people, if you died within 24 hours, where would you be in eternity? Heaven or hell? He'd finish work at 2 o'clock in the afternoon in King's Cross in Palmer Street, and he would walk up, right up to the town hall, stand on town hall steps and go, excuse me, mate, can I ask you a question? And that's how he started. 41, 42, the war was on, the sailors were coming to Sydney, and he was in his element. He'd found his niche to speak to sailors every day. And so he would walk up to a sailor and say, excuse me, mate, do you mind if I ask you a question?
The streets were flooded with thousands of servicemen and women, sailors and soldiers and airmen. And many of these young men and women had been in war theatres and they'd been powerfully affected by the visions that they'd had of war.
We completed the war in Europe by doing convoy work to the beachheads in Normandy, sent us home on leave, and I was told I was going to Australia. And it was on the first Sunday in Sydney that I and a chap named Frank Burton, we decided to go and see the sights of Sydney. And this chap came running up to us and said, hey, you chaps, stop, I want to ask you a question. Where will you go when you die? It must be either heaven or hell. And I said, oh, come on, Frank, this chap's a crank. However, he engaged us in conversation, and we went on our way. And we sat down to our meal together and both looked up from our meal. And we said, you know, there was something about that man that rang true. We ought to go and hear what they have to say, because he'd invited us to a Brethren assembly for a service. It was a Sunday. I'd come under tremendous conviction. I wasn't right with God, but this man, Jenner, had disturbed me to the depths of my being. The question and what the disturbance it had made, it wouldn't go away. I thought, oh well, next day, forget it all, you know. But it didn't. That didn't work. God had clearly spoken, and His Spirit was at work. And He invited us along to several Bible studies that He had in this little humble home in Sydney. And I can remember, I had a cabin, of course, on the ship, and I can remember dreaming one night the Lord had come back and I wasn't right, wasn't ready. So that the question and what the disturbance it had made was with me for the next 18 months or so. Then I was demobbed, came back to my hometown in Bournemouth, and I was invited to an evangelistic campaign in Bournemouth that year. A man named Francis Dixon preached on the text, "My spirit will not always strive with man." And I realized from what he was saying that God was saying to me, look, I've been talking to you now for 18 months and more, that I knelt down and accepted Christ as my Saviour.
My father was born in Southampton in England, but my father unfortunately was the rebel of the family, and he was a naughty boy and put on a ship right away, because in those days they didn't have detention schools. He was put on a ship.
When he came back after 4 years, land life was not for him, and he joined the British Navy. He jumped ship, and then he joined the American Navy. And then he became a gambling addict. He learned the game crap.
They have, in their naval uniform, they have a little pocket up here on their uniform, and in there he kept a rabbit's foot,
which he would rub with his left fingers while he rolled the dice with his right hand.
And he was a very, very heavy gambler. And because of this rabbit's foot, he developed the name of Bones. Until the day he died, his naval name was always Bones Jenner. He came to Australia from the American Navy, and once again he jumped ship. So this old white-haired gentleman came up to me and said, "Oh, you're on your own, are you?" He said, "I'm catching the train here. Would you like to come home?" Yes, because Dad was thinking, oh, here's a free meal. I don't have to worry about this. Here's a free meal. So he went in, and then when he went in, there was my mother.
Jessie, their eldest daughter, and they were married a year later in the Flinders Naval Depot in Melbourne. He then joined the Australian Navy. He was transferred across to England to bring back HMAS Canberra from England. So he was living the life of a sailor, although he was married. Walking down Collins Street in Melbourne, he saw a group of dark-suited gentlemen who were standing in a circle and preaching. For a lark, he jumped into the middle of the ring himself and said,
"Well, I'll tell you what," he said, "I'll make you a deal. I'll listen to you if you'll listen to me first." They said, "You're all right then?" "Yes, certainly, by all means."
And he got down on the footpath and started showing them the game crap.
Out with his rabbit's foot, rubbed his rabbit, "Roll 'em, cowboy, roll 'em, cowboy."
Teaching these austere brethren, who are from the Glanton Brethren Assembly, how to play crap.
And he said, "Right, now I've showed you mine, now what's yours?" So they said, "Well, look, we're going up to a prayer meeting. Would you like to come?" He went with them. And that night they taught him the story of salvation and how Jesus came to die for him. And he suddenly realised that he was a sinner. There and then knelt down and took Jesus as his saviour into his heart.
Because when he came home, he told his wife, Jessie, he said, "You're a sinner and you're going to hell and you need to be saved." She thought he had gone mad or was afflicted with some type of religious mania. Frank was still gambling.
His gambling was getting on top of him, and she said, "I'm going." So she took me as a baby and they went and lived on a farm. So he went back to the ship and he went to Singapore. While he was away, he realised how much he missed his wife and his baby.
He made arrangements for her and Anne when he was moved to Sydney to board with a Christian home in Sydney. Jessie was converted in that home. It was quite a miracle of grace because she was very resistant to the gospel.
So he left the Navy immediately because he knew he couldn't stay in the environment. He decided then that he had to find some place of worship. And he joined with a group called the Brethren. And they showed him and taught him very gently. There was another way of life completely.
Frank Jenner moved from the assembly at Petersham to fellowship, the assembly which met in Goulburn Street. This was in the old Salvation Army Citadel, which was about a stone's throw from the corner of George Street and Goulburn Street. And so any contacts that he made there, he would direct them within view down to the Gospel Hall. But in that place in Goulburn Street Assembly, there was a great work done for God. They used to have meetings for the down and outs of the city. And Frank Jenner would bring these in too, bring them along. He would always be a person who would fill the seats for evangelistic meetings. And during the war years, there were always naval vessels moored coming and going into Sydney Harbour, especially when the Pacific War commenced, and many sailors from the United States and Britain and India were seen walking the streets of Sydney.
We'd been in action against the Japanese at Palembang. It was in Sumatra. We'd been attacking the oil refineries. After a while, they decided to come around to the Pacific to help join up with the American fleet in the Pacific. On the way around, we called in at Sydney. On 3 occasions, I was stopped by Frank Jenner in the city. He wasn't aware that I was the same person. I think he was stopping all servicemen to have the opportunity to. But I was looking in a camera shop window in the Piccadilly Arcade, and he tapped me on the shoulder and said, "Do you mind if I ask you a personal question?" And I said, "No, that's all right." He said, "If you were to die within the next 24 hours, where would your soul be?" And I told him I was a Christian and I knew quite well where my soul would be. And he invited me out to his home. Well, when we arrived at Frank Jenner's, there were a group of servicemen from the ship, and 2 of them that I knew. That's where I met Beth, my future wife.
Mr. and Mrs. Jenner and their daughter Anne. Anne was my friend, and we attended the Gospel Hall at Goulburn Street. He'd have special nights in his home for servicemen, and my parents were involved too. They used to have scripture readings at the time amongst the servicemen who were there. People responded to him in an amazing way. I don't think people ever realised, those people in the church will ever realise the enormity of his mission and the effect that it had on so many people. He changed my life because I met a very special man, Norrie, who became my husband, and we've had a wonderful, wonderful, happy life.
He had a unique way of stopping a meeting too, in his own home. He'd slip out the door into his bedroom and then come back and appear in his pyjamas, fully clothed in his pyjamas, and say, "The meeting's finished." And they all knew then that it was over. He would say, "I'm sorry, I have an appointment at 5 a.m. with the King of Kings."
During that time, he joined a group called the Navigators, who were a group of Christian people, mainly dealing with servicemen. And in the wartime, it was very, very difficult to get onto the ships. But Dad, with his job, he had a little card that gave him the authority to go onto all of the ships. Now that is invaluable because during the war, it was total blackout. The ships would come into the harbour and the captain would not know where he was going. And because he worked for the Department of Navy, they would give him a letter and with that letter he would have to go out to the ship. Then he would hand the captain the letter. Then the captain would open it up and then he'd know where he was going. But Dad would go onto the ships and he would put a little placard up. Navigators, if anybody's looking for Christian fellowship, ring up LM 1887, that was the old telephone number. Ring up that number and there's always a warm Christian fellowship waiting. Catch the train to Petersham Station and ask the man there what to do. All these sailors would get off the ship, 20, 30 more. Oh, you're after Frank Jenner, are you? Out there and down, turn to the right, keep going down, you'll come to it. 7 o'clock in the morning, you'd hear the beautiful singing and the noise. The neighbour, oh no, not another lot. And here they were, all these sailors coming down the street, 20, 30 at a time, first thing in the morning, because they would have come in overnight, possibly going the next day. But they would all come in and Mum would say, Anne, put some more water on the soup, here's another crowd coming. And there was always enough. The neighbours would come in with a coupon. Mrs. Jenner, here's a coupon for some milk. Here's a coupon for some butter. Here's a pound of sugar. I've got a bit of this. And they would share. They were just all different types. Some came to have a good time, to see who it was for curiosity. Others just wanted fellowship. And so one was able to lead to the other, and Dad was able to lead hundreds of them, literally hundreds of them, to the Lord.
And many sailors on the streets of Sydney, he helped out. He was generous to them, giving them all the change he had in his pocket to give them a bed for the night. Never a rich man himself. He was always prepared to help others, and they realised his sincerity and his concern for them. Often he would work a room of sailors in these drop-in centres, and before long he had 6 or 8 of them following him out the door, down to the train station. He'd take them home for a meal.
So Mum and I used to write hundreds of letters to like there might be Billy Smith from America. So we'd write to Billy Smith's mother, it was lovely to have your son over at our place for dinner last night. So Billy Smith's mother, oh, my son must be safe, he must be in Australia, he must be there. And letters came from mothers, letters came from fathers, from sweethearts to thank us. Towards the end of the war, there was more sailors residing in Sydney for longer times. And he would go to the churches, get the men and say to them, right, would you like to take a carload of people? Would you like to get a carload of sailors? Take them over to your place, take them back to your church. And so all these men would meet him at Johnny's, which was the sailors' rest home in Sydney, with all these cars. And they would line up with one driver, one car, and he'd say, I want the rest of the car emptied. And he'd fill them up. Would you like to go for a drive? Oh, yeah, sure, mate, yeah, sure. And he'd get them, and this was his new work now. And he would take them to fill up these cars with all these sailors. So that extended the work out.
I remember him coming to our meetings, our gospel meetings, and bringing a line of sailors. He didn't believe in preaching to seats and saints, and he would co-opt brethren who had motor cars to help him in bringing sailors from the docks to the meetings and to our fellowship teas.
I was 14 at the time. It might have been in roughly 1945, 46. I went to the same church as he was attending. We'd be standing round as kids outside the church. Quite often he'd come up behind us and he'd plant his hands on our shoulders and say, he said, let's go fishing, he said. And he'd been wanting me to go into Sydney with him and tackle some soldiers and sailors, bring them back to the church for the gospel service that night. I remember my dad would go in with him, take his car in. If they got too many servicemen for one car, they'd hire a taxi, and there'd be often a fleet of taxis come back. But in those days they could pack 8 people into a car. There was no limit to the amount of guys you could put in.
Many of them went out of our gospel hall, and I witnessed this, but having publicly on their knees made a confession, a profession rather we might say, of Christ as Saviour.
I wasn't in the war, it was after the war. I did ground training at WWII it was, Forest Hill, so I wasn't in combat, but I was on the ground crew working on the plains. When I was walking down George Street, a man came up to me. He wanted to ask me a question. He said, if you were to die within 24 hours, where would you spend eternity? It stunned me in a way because he confronted me with mortality. I was young and vibrant there, and I thought, oh, who's this busybody? I've got to go and get the next tram. And he told me he's going to a fellowship meeting at Renwick Hall, and he asked me to come along with him. And he took me into Renwick Hall. As soon as I heard the gospel, something struck me, had a peace and a joy that overwhelmed me in that hall. And I just sobbed and sobbed and sobbed. I knew that God had spoken in my heart through Frank Jenner. And he was so humble, and I was so thrilling that I had met him. And not only that, I was able to visit the Jenners' home, and they were like a family to me.
This question of Frank Jenner was very powerful and remembered for years after. I corresponded with some of these servicemen. They remembered Frank Jenner very well and saw him often in action on the streets of Sydney during the war.
I attended Lansdowne Baptist Church, Bournemouth. Francis Dixon was the minister there, and there came a point when I was involved with leading the young people, and a man named Noel Stanton came down to lead our young people's weekend, and I stood at the back of the church because he was leading it it was in the church hall actually. He was on the platform and Francis Dixon was by my side, and this chap got up and said, I was walking down one of the main thoroughfares in Sydney, Australia. A man came bounding up to me and said, where will you go when you die? It must be either heaven or hell. And Francis Dixon said, this man is giving your testimony for you. And it so impressed Francis that when he was asked by the Keswick Convention to go on a preaching tour of Australia, he began to tell the story of how a simple question would prompt people to think and turn to Christ.
His first meeting was in Adelaide, and when my parents arrived at the evening meeting, my mother was introduced to their hosts for the next few days, Murray Wilkes and his wife. And my father preached, and he felt compelled to mention about this evangelist he'd heard about through Peter and through Noel. Who was this man? And he told the story in that meeting in Adelaide, and my mother said that Murray Wilkes immediately started throwing his arms around. He stood to his feet and he said, I'm another. And the story was that back in George Street years before, he'd been approached by who they discovered was Frank Jenner, and he was asked that famous question, if you were to die tonight, where would you go, heaven or hell?
During that tour, Francis Dixon was conducting meetings at a big Methodist church in Perth. He felt the Lord laid on his heart to share the parable of the Good Samaritan. He mentioned Peter Culver, Noel and Murray Wilkes, who had been converted through Frank Jenner. After the service, as people were dispersing and leaving the church, and the young man said, Mr. Dixon, I was serving with the Royal Australian Navy. My ship was in Sydney. I walked up George Street, and the man came and asked me the question, young man, where would you go if you were to die tonight? Would it be heaven or would it be hell? And he said, I'm another.
Well, when my father mentioned to Alec Gilchrist he would love to meet this man, the evangelist from George Street, Alec Gilchrist said, well, I know where he is, I can arrange this for you. So in between meetings, my parents went on the bus out of Sydney to Frank Jenner's home. They arrived at Frank's house. He met Jessie, his wife, and Jessie said, "I'm going out to make a pot of tea." My father was just talking and said, "Frank, do you realise I know of 4 men who were servicemen who were spoken to by you in George Street, and how that they, as a result of your question, subsequently have given their lives to Jesus Christ." And Jessie came in the room, and Frank, with tears rolling down his cheeks, said, "These folks have come to say that not only have 4 men come to know Christ, but they're going on with the Lord." Frank showed my parents the bus stop, and they said their goodbyes, and as they were getting on the bus, my father turned round to say another goodbye and thank you for having us, and there was Frank, just a few feet away, talking to someone about the Lord.
On returning to England, in the Lake District in northwest England, he told the story of Frank Jenner. And at the conclusion of the service, a young man went up to him at the door of the church and said, "Mr. Dixon, I'm another. I was there in Australia. I was asked the question. I was born again subsequently." And he said, "I am soul winning myself for Christ." Francis Dixon, at the invitation of the Keswick Convention, did a lengthy tour of India in 1957. And he was down south in the Nilgiri Hills and ministering to missionaries. And he sought the Lord, and the Lord seemed to say to him, "Tell them the story of Frank Jenner." And he did. He told the story. And a girl in one of the corners, her head was down, and she started to weep. And she went to Mr. Dixon afterwards and she said, "I'm another." He asked me the question in George Street. And as a result of this, I came to know Christ as my Lord and Saviour. And I offered for missionary service in India.
Well, in 1961, my father went out to the States and had quite a busy time there. They really worked him hard. And there was an extra week in Jamaica, and it got to the last evening, and he said, "I'm just going to speak about Frank Jenner tonight." And afterwards, a tall Australian man came up to my father and said, "I have the same story. I'm another."
However, there were other street evangelists in operation in Sydney, and they were his good friends and colleagues. One of them, whom I remember very well, was Dave Roston, a big man with a large forehead, big head, and a mane of hair like a lion's mane. And he was a specialist in soapbox oratory on the streets of Sydney, had a real gift for it. And one day, hearing that his friend Frank was going away on a short holiday, he thought he would take over his work. So he went down to the Rocks area and he accosted a young man with the famous Jenner question. And this young man was frightened out of his life. He sent the big man flying backwards with a punch to his midriff. He thought he was in physical danger. Dave Roston, I think, learned that you cannot do another man's work. Dave Roston had his own unique style and gift. So did Frank Jenner. His question was not known to the wider Christian community until it started leaking out, his work that he was doing in the latter part of his life when he was becoming frailer and more incapacitated. And even then, Frank still walked the beat up and down George Street.
But not all of us would be called to this ministry. Frank felt it was what the Lord wanted him to do, and he did it faithfully. And through Francis Dixon's travels and using the story, we can learn the legacy that many came to faith in Christ.
It is hard to say how many people Frank touched during his lifetime. He started as soon as he was converted at the age of 37. And he made a vow to God that he would attempt to speak to 10 people every day about their souls. And as far as we can tell, he kept that vow. So it must have been for at least 28 years he was working in that way. And one could say that he must have spoken to about 100,000 people on the streets of Sydney. Not just with that question, but with those whom he witnessed to off the streets, in his own home, in the dropout centres, in the parks of the city. He worked the parks of Sydney, Botanic Gardens and Hyde Park. He used to spend whole weekends there, just speaking to people.
He was what we'd say he was someone that had the guts to go in front fellas and talk to them about the Lord Jesus. It's a pity there's not more of them about now.
When he approached to ask this question, anybody, he would always pluck this card out of his pocket and read it. I can do all things through Christ which strengthens me. I remember Frank Jenner best in his latter years, which was not his best, when he was past his prime, when the ravages of Parkinson's disease and dementia were taking their toll on him. This was when he was in his early 70s, when he was still able to come out to the meetings. He was not really appreciated as fully as he could have been in his the days of his the prime days of his ministry.
He loved uniforms in the latter part of his life, and he would go down to the police station because they had navy blue uniforms on, and he would get a little bit disorientated, and they would take him for a little drive around, take him down by the water, then they'd bring him up and they'd bring his mum up. Jessie, we're just bringing him in right now. All right then. And the police car would come in and bring him in, and he'd have a little talk, and then he'd go. Did you put him back to bed? When he died, the police gave him a police escort. The police cars took him down to the cemetery for his funeral. But it was a victory service. It was not a service of anything else. And it was a life. Well, he said, I just want the Lord to say, well done, thou good and faithful servant. Then Mum passed away exactly 2 years later.
Well, Frank Jenner has been an inspiration and a motivation to many people who've read about his life and have known him when the full story came out. God has given all of us a work to do, and we're all individuals, and we should try to find out what that work is. Frank Jenner discovered what his work was very early. Secondly, he was consistent and persistent in it. He sowed the seed for many years. Sowing the seed is so important. Anyone can reap the harvest, someone says, but it takes skill to sow the seed. And there won't be any harvest unless the seed is sown. Finally, the message he had, it was meant to shock and startle, and it did. And today we sometimes say we have to build bridges, we have to go kindly and gently with people. Well, not necessarily so. The message of the gospel is a warning as well as a welcome to Christ. But Frank Jenner, he didn't do any harm to himself or the Christian testimony by that startling and stunning, as it were, question that he asked. It made those young men and women think, and God used him in that way.
The legacy of Mr. Jenner is quite profound. He stopped my father in George Street in Sydney during the war, not once but 3 occasions, so that's a miracle in itself. And on the 3rd occasion, he invited my father to go back to a church function where he met my mother. So the reality is I wouldn't be here today if it wasn't for Mr. Jenner. So in our family, his legacy is very real and very tangible. but I'm probably just one of many thousands that he's impacted across the globe, for that matter. And I'm representing the second generation, and Stephen's representing the third generation of that legacy.
You know, I think if you look back at his story, you've got a man who was just being obedient to what God had called him to do. And, you know, out of that obedience, how many lives have actually been affected because of those, you know, the simple thing he just went about doing that he felt called to do. And, you know, maybe in some small way, his legacy has been continued through the lives that we're able to live, and to continue his story and to continue the things that he stood for, and seeing God's kingdom advance throughout the world. And we're privileged enough to be a part of that.
A poem was written by Camilla Deanne about Frank Jenner. It is called The Eternity Question and sums up the story well. In George Street, Sydney, for many years, trusting in God to allay his fears, a one-time sailor, politely spoken, gentleman, many souls had woken. Gradually the tales came out, across the globe and round about, how this sincere and faithful man spoke Christ's message the world to span. Excuse me, sir, but may I ask, if you've ever thought upon this task? If you died tonight, where would you go? God says heaven or hell is eternal, you know. Please think about this, sir. Toodaloo, he'd say as he disappeared from view. The exact words weren't as above or in rhyme, but the message remains, and over time, an English pastor amazingly found that testimony repeated the world around. Some were Navy personnel on wartime leave whose tales did tell, each confrontation identical, but the message became very personal. In Australia, Jamaica, India and UK, even pastors and missionaries the same did relay. For some 23 years Mr. Jenner did spend time planting eternity, Christ's message to send. He always carried a card, never found it easy. I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. When Mr. Frank Jenner was 50 years old, that pastor tracked him down and told of the fruitfulness of his vital question, God's affirmation of his intention. He was humble indeed, and so grateful to know Christ had tolerated him and had used him to show so many his message on eternity's time that bore fruit, revealing some souls need to climb past the humdrum of here and now to learn about Christ and make the vow to commit to a life of faithfulness, accepting the gift of joyfulness. So think about this. If you died tonight, would you be headed toward Christ's light? Would you have certain hope and serenity of spending in heaven eternity?